All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. We've got about half the people that signed up on, so I think that's a pretty good number to get started with. So welcome to the webinar, Real-Time Reporting and Pre-Save Validation with Groovy. I always struggle with these webinars because I don't get much feedback. So I'm going to try to open it up every so often periodically for people to ask questions. Just a little bit about myself real quick. I have been doing this for a long time. My son's going to college in another week, so that's how old I am. I started off in finance and accounting, and for those of you who have heard me talk before, I'll tell you that I hated doing what I was doing, and the only part of what I liked was trying to figure out a way to not do it, which kind of pushed me into more of the technology side, and I've been doing it ever since. If you need to reach out to me, there's two ways you can contact me identified here. You can email me at Into Hyperion, which is my blog, which I think many of you have already signed up to get notifications from, and also my email at Xalytics. If you want to get notified about further webinars and other information that I share, there are two ways to do it, and you can sign up again at intohyperion.com, or you can go to my LinkedIn group. So like I said, the format of this is I'm going to try to make it as interactive as possible because it's very hard for me to talk for a long time and not get some interaction. Everybody's on mute, and I will, when we do demonstrations, after the demonstrations are over, I will open it up and have everybody available to ask questions. And I apologize, but I haven't found a way to unmute everybody. So you should be able to raise your hand. There's a button that's like raise your hand, and I can see that, and then I can unmute you when we open it up for questions. So organizationally, just real quick, we're going to go through some of this relatively quickly because I think a lot of you are more interested in seeing the demonstration and seeing how it can benefit your implementations. But I'll do a brief introduction on Groovy and how it applies to ePBCS. And then there are two main functions that I think Groovy can add to your applications. One is performance, and it's mind-blowing performance. Also pre-save validation, which some people over or underestimate the value of the pre-save validation. But I can tell you that it creates so much more accountability and accuracy for planners that it's extremely useful. And I'll give you some examples of how that has been implemented to help improve the accuracy of budgets. We'll talk about where this fits and if Groovy is right for you to look at. And then we're going to go into the deep dive on the features, and that's where I'll do the demonstration. And then we'll finish it up and open it up to questions, and I'll answer questions until there are no more questions. So a couple things that I think are of benefit to understand, and a lot of our clients, and when I was in finance, I had these same issues with the Hyperion toolset or the Oracle toolset now with planning and S-Base. C-level executives get frustrated because they can't get reports that they want throughout the day, and there's always this gap of waiting for consolidations to run. A lot of people have to wait when they mirror models or when they sync up models. So if there's a product model or a workforce or a CapEx model, that data has to get consolidated and moved over to the financial planning application to see the net impact. And sometimes that takes a fair amount of time. The planners will often complain that they can't finish their forecast because if they make a change to CapEx, they don't see the net impact on the total P&L. And plans and forecasts are often wrong due to data entry errors. And again, this can be fat fingering things, entering rates without entering volumes without drivers, not fully allocating something. And those cause a lot of issues because when the budget gets submitted and you have to go back to your CFO and explain to them that somebody didn't enter the budget correctly and they're short, it never goes very well. So I won't read through this, but what I can say is if you think about all of those things not being an issue, that's kind of what Groovy does for you. So a planner would be able to change, let's say the union or the job title or the salary of one employee, and then immediately see a fully updated P&L. CFOs can get reports anytime. P&L managers don't have to wait to get real-time reporting. Planners can enter changes at any model and see the impact of that immediately in the financial planning application. Planners are a lot more confident because there's a lot more pre-validation that goes into the data entry. So there's a lot more accuracy and ownership of the data that gets entered into the planning application. So what does this kind of mean for a developer or a user? So there's a couple things. Again, like I talked about, the proactive user input validation. So prior to this, typically what happened was somebody saved the data, it saved to the database, and then there was a calculation that executed and did some if or what if analysis on the data that was entered. And if it wasn't entered correctly, it would traffic light a form, or it would respond and say, this isn't correct and you have to fix it. But there wasn't anything that made them fix it, and the data was submitted. So if they didn't fix it, it was wrong. A lot of that stuff can completely go away. And if you've worked with PBCS, you will know on the data forms, when you do the data synchronization from a BSO to an ASO cube, sometimes they can take a long time. There's memory issues with it. What Groovy will do will allow you to selectively push only the data that's changed. And on the same token, the S-based logic, as you know, when you save a form, it will run the business logic on every row and every column in that form. So if you have a form that has, let's say 10,000 rows, and you change 2 rows on it, the calculation will run on all 10,000, not just the 2 that you changed. That completely goes away. So the effectiveness of the business logic that gets executed on those saves becomes much smaller and much more condensed, and you get much better performance. You also have access to almost all of the Java functions to be able to do a lot more complex logic than you could in an S-based calculation. And all that leads to this real-time consolidated reporting. So with the ability to selectively calculate, move data, and then also move data from your models to your P&L at a consolidated level becomes real time, because we don't have to consolidate the data in the BSO application anymore. And I'll go through an example of that in a minute. You can also execute calculations directly on the ASO cube, which you really could never do before. So we actually have a client, and a colleague of mine built everything in Groovy. So he completely bypassed the BSO S-based logic. So he actually built a planning application with no S-based logic at all. You also have custom errors. You now can throw errors to the job console with exactly what you want in that error or that job. You have advanced traffic lighting, and you also have custom errors that prompt a user. So you can basically return any error that you want. The description, the language, all of that stuff can be defined and used and shared within all the calculations. And then it becomes a better experience for the user because they know exactly what the error is. This also interacts with strategic modeling. So if you use strategic modeling, you can dynamically push the data as soon as you make it in the data form and planning directly to strategic modeling, and you can talk back and forth. Licensing with Groovy, and this is a bit of a frustration for people, but the licensing is available. You get Groovy Calculations with ePBCS, or if you have PBCS +1, you get access to the Groovy Calculations. PBCS +1 is PBCS and one of the modules. This is not available in on-prem, and from what I've been told, there's no roadmap to push this to on-prem. So to take advantage of this, you're going to have to go to the cloud. So the performance improvements that I talked about, and when I say that it's truly real-time reporting, I really mean it. This is a production application of a client that I use Groovy Calculations for, and we started this implementation prior to Groovy being available. So the forms on the product level database started out with the business logic would execute. So that's the S-base calculation, and it would take on the form that we were testing this on, it was a couple hundred rows. It took 26 seconds. And the reason it took 26 seconds on 100 rows was because they were entering data at a total and it was doing allocation. So there was actually a fair amount of logic that was going on. The smart push, pushing it to the ASO cube, took another almost 15 seconds. And then to consolidate the BSO cube to push at a consolidated level, like at no union, no employee, those types of levels, to push to the P&L cube that didn't have those dimensions, took a minute, almost a minute and a half. So, and this was on a smaller form. So when you look at this, you're looking at, close to 2 minutes every time somebody saved the form, which, was just, it was unacceptable to them. So we started looking at Groovy and we rewrote some of this logic to use Groovy. So basically what it does is, when they save the web form, sorry about this, my PowerPoint just crashed. Okay, so sorry for the interruption. So basically what happens is when we change this to Groovy, you can see at the bottom, you'll see the, excuse me, the time that it took once we used Groovy. So what was happening is if a user changed 2 rows, it would only calculate those 2 rows. So it dynamically generated a fixed statement for the S-base calculation. It would dynamically generate the overrides for the pushes, and it would take the consolidated data from the ASO cube on the model, and it would push that directly to the financial application that didn't have the additional dimensions. So it basically completely eliminated any consolidations that were ever needed in the application by doing this. So that means that if I went in and I changed the employee from Union A to Union B, within 2 seconds, I could go to my full P&L and see the results. And that's currency conversion, everything. From a administrator perspective, you can also use Groovy and save yourself a lot of time. So on the automated process for the global consolidations, for this product cube that we were working on, it took 663 seconds when I ran it, which is roughly an hour. And with Groovy, it took 12 seconds. So if you think of a global rate change and everything has to be calculated and then consolidated and then moved, and those types of situations, we got the calculations from an hour down to 12 seconds. So the pre-save validation, this is the other thing that I think is, like I said, is way underestimated. Basically, you can do these validations, and the validations that you can do are completely up to your imagination. So pretty much anything that you want to do is possible. And what happens is when the user saves the form, it runs through these validations, and the validations will stop that data from getting saved. So prior to this, the data would saved, and then you would have to tell the user to fix it. Well, now it doesn't even let them save anything that violates any of these rules. So the validation rules, if no validation exists, the operation moves on, the data gets saved to the database, and then the rest of the business logic gets executed. If the violations do exist, then it stops and it says you have to fix these. The cells get highlighted. You add tooltips to the cells so that they know exactly why it's wrong. On runtime prompts, you can also do validation on runtime prompts, so you can tell them exactly what's wrong and they have to fix that before they can continue. So the big benefit is the data has to be right before they save it. So I've worked on this with 2 different clients now, and this was released back in July of last year, so it hasn't been out that long. And I've used it on 2 clients, and I can tell you that anybody who has an on-prem or a cloud application that's not taking advantage of this is a candidate to look at implementing Groovy Calculations. I haven't been excited about, ASO was kind of exciting when it came out, just because of the pre-consolidations. But this is completely new. The speed is mind-blowing. The things that you can do are, like I said, totally up to your imagination. And there isn't anything that I've come across that I can't do or that I haven't been able to do. So whether you're a new implementation or an existing implementation, if you've got complex models or large dimensions or users that require immediate feedback when they make changes, this is something that will help you better your service level to your customers. All right, so I'm going to pause for a second and see if anybody has any questions. So if you can click the hand, I'll kind of monitor this and I'll give it a minute. Okay, Joe. Joe, do you have a question? All right, anybody else have a question? All right, well, we will continue. So I'll open this back up for questions after I do the demonstrations. So the application that I'm demoing, this is an application that was a production application at a client. The data, the volume of data that is in it is actually twice as big as the production application. The metadata is nearly twice as large. So I don't want you to think that I scaled down anything to make this look any better than it actually is. So it's actually, much larger. So the traffic lighting. With traffic lighting, you can interact with users. You can draw attention to important details. You can show them what they have to enter in a form. You can highlight variances. And I know that you can do that some with the validations that you can do in the form itself, but the level of sophistication that you can do with the traffic lighting with Groovy is completely way over the top of what is available in the forms. So like I said, you can set background colors, you can set tooltips, you can add validation without throwing errors. Again, it's almost limitless what you can do. So I'm going to actually skip this demonstration because I'm going to use it in the next demonstration. We'll just do them together. So the real-time consolidated reporting, and for those of you who are familiar with this, you'll understand that the process that you have without Groovy is you've got your detailed models. When you save those, they get pushed to your reporting cube for that detailed model. So if this was a workforce model, it get pushed to the reporting workforce model. Then on the workforce application, you'd have to run all the consolidations on union and department and job title and employee name. And then you would have to push that to the consolidated application. Then you'd have to consolidate the P&L and then push that to the ASO application. So with Groovy, you basically bypass the BSO consolidation altogether. So it goes from the model to the ASO, and then now that the ASO of, say, workforce, it's pre-consolidated, you can actually take that data and move it directly to both of the P&L applications, both the BSO and the ASO. So if you have other logic that needs to be executed, you could push that to the BSO, then you could run that logic on that point of view, and then push that to the ASO queue. So literally, taxes, drivers on that application, everything can be done at once on a form save. And again, you truly get that real-time reporting. So this just kind of highlights, what I just said. A user enters data, the data gets saved to the BSO application, the business logic runs, the smart push pushes it to ASO, and then bam, you've got your consolidated data at a P&L level. So I'm going to walk through, and as great as this is, demoing it is, it kind of is what it is. So there isn't a lot of fancy things that I can show you, but what I will do is show you that it works, and I'll show you how fast it works. Okay, so what I've done is I've created a dashboard, and this isn't really typically what I would use a dashboard for, but this dashboard is going to have 3 different grids in it. The one at the top of the grid, or at the dashboard, is my data entry form. These bottom 2 grids are the ASO cube. So the first one is the reporting cube for this gross profit model. The one over on the right is the reporting cube for the P&L. So this grid doesn't have things like up here, the market. It doesn't have sales channel. It doesn't have all of the products. And basically what this form does is it overrides the data. So I'm going to go in, and just so that you can see a drastic difference, I'm going to change this one line, and I'm going to grow it very large. So you can see down here that I've got 339 or 391,000. I'm going to increase the case growth. There is a bug right now with this. The first time you run these calculations, they take longer than any other time you run them. So this might take 5 or 10 seconds, but well, it's finished. So it's pretty quick. So this actually calculated on about 500,000 or 5,000 blocks of data. I did the calculation before I ran it. So you notice down here that in the ASO cube for the gross profit model and the P&L model, they both went up and they both tie. So when I say it's true real-time reporting, that's exactly what it is. I made a change to a product level data for all of its markets, for all of its sales channels, and within 2 or 3 seconds, that data is consolidated in both the reporting cubes. The traffic lighting is another thing that I was going to show you in here, and traffic lighting can be whatever you want it to be. In this case, anytime anybody loads an override over here, it will identify the rows that have been changed. So in this case, all of these cells have been overridden except for that second row. So again, traffic lighting, there's nothing fancy about it. It's just that you can pretty much do anything that you want to draw attention to, certain things. And like I said, it's much more robust than the built-in logic in the forms. So what just happened, and I'll go through what's going on in this calculation. There's a couple different things. First of all, when I saved this one row, the only thing that ran on that calculation was that one row, and it ran for all 12 months. So basically what it did was create a dynamic S-base fix. And this kind of graphically shows what's going on. So prior to the ability, man, sorry guys. So prior to Groovy, what was happening is every row was getting executed. The calculation logic on every row is getting executed, because in the business rules, we didn't have access to fix on what changed. You had to do the at relative, and it took every single row. With Groovy, now we can isolate just the rows that have changed. So in this graphic, basically what's happened is that I've changed 2 products, and I've changed that data in 1, 2, 3, 4 months. So in this case, I can fix on just those 4 months for just those 2 products and execute that calculation logic. On the maps, exactly the same thing. You basically take the same logic that we did on the filter of what's changed, and you override the data map with those changes so that it only pushes the data that's actually changed. So again, I can go back over here, and I changed this 3rd row. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to reset that back to its defaults. So this is basically going to come up, and this is another thing that you can do. You can prompt the users to make sure that they want to do it. This gives them a warning that says, are you sure you want to do this? It's going to clear data. So if I launch this, it's going to reset this back to the seeded data values. So you'll see that the 3rd row will no longer be red, and you'll see that the units and the rest of the data in the 2 consolidation reporting applications will both go back to what they were before. So you see that that row went back to what its original seeded amounts were, and then you'll see that the data over here in both of the consolidated cubes, reporting cubes, are both back to what they were before. So that's how quick you can execute this stuff. All right, anybody have a question on what we just walked through on this real-time reporting? All right, we'll continue. The grid builder. The grid builder is the method that's used within Groovy to do a lot of the things that make this all possible. So you can move data from ASO to BSO. You can move data from BSO to BSO if you wanted to, or ASO to ASO. Any combination that you can think of, you can move data back and forth with this. It does bypass some of the security issues that are in data maps. It can do, again, you're using Java and Groovy behind the scenes, so it can really do anything you want from a mapping perspective. You can perform calculations outside of SBase, like I talked about before. The performance improvements over the data maps and smart pushes, there actually is improvements if you, rather than doing a smart push, you can use the data grid. And again, you can write directly to the ASO and bypass BSO altogether. The custom logs. This is actually something that I didn't expect to get any benefit out, but you have the ability in a calculation now to write out to the job console anything you want. So you can write out who wrote it. You can write out how long it took. You can do what the POV was. Really anything you want to do, you can log out. And this is just an example. So on that calculation that I just ran, this is the example of the log that would get spit out. So it identifies that you save the data. It identifies that you're running a push and you're only pushing it for these products. These will be the products that I changed. So in this case, you'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rows that you changed. And it took just over 2 seconds. It identifies the point of view. It gives you the row headers and the column headers. And then this piece down here is how much data moved to the ASO cubes. So when I save the data, the consolidated data from the gross profit model that went to the P&L model, there were 311 cells that changed, and there were no cells that rejected. and that took 0.4 seconds. So it took a half a second to basically do effectively consolidate your BSO application and move it. So just to give you an idea how fast that is. Runtime prompts. So runtime prompts, you can do a ton of things with runtime prompts now. You can confirm execution, which I just showed you. You can confirm that a process was executed. You can also validate runtime prompts for certain inputs. So let's say that you were going to add a person and you had to enter their telephone number. You could validate that the telephone number was an actual valid telephone number. And if it wasn't, it would stop that person from using or from continuing that runtime prompt. So a couple examples of the runtime prompts. So I'm going to go to workforce. And I've got a couple hires in here that I've already added. But if I right click and I change this and I want to add a new hire, just, little things like selective date. Like I can, let's say I wanted to hire this person today, and then I wanted to terminate them at the end of the year. Let's just say that I changed this to December and made this 17 instead of 18, and I put the 31st, an hourly rate, it was just one person, and I tried to lock this. It's going to come back and tell me that the termination date is before the hire date, and I can't do that. So you can, like I said, you can do all kinds of things in here. You can validate that, let's say that they can't enter more than 10 people if you want. You could validate that, only certain job titles are available for unions. So if you pick a union, maybe they only have three of the job titles that they can pick from. Let's say that you put in a person's name or a job description and you don't want any special characters. You can use the validation rules to make sure that they don't enter pound signs or dashes or anything but letters. The other one that we just went through was the overrides form, where we can effectively override data from any level of the dimensions. So if I right click, and I also have the option to clear out all or reset all of the products on this page, I click this, you can prompt, are you sure you want to do this? There's a lot of data that you're going to undo that you have entered. So, you kind of force them to take one more step to make sure that it's what they want to do. Anybody have any questions on that? Okay. Data form validation. We've talked about this, and there's a lot of benefits to this, I think. Obviously, the reliability of the data, the proactive nature in which you can have them fix problems. You can use this as an educational forum because they may not know that there are certain validation rules that exist. Maybe they don't know that I can't pay a manager more than $150,000. And you can stop, like I said, you can stop the users from entering data that's not right and improve the validity of these budgets, and also eliminate, or not eliminate, but you could definitely reduce the firestorms that people have at the end of a budgeting cycle when they find out that there's data that wasn't entered correctly. So I'm going to go through a couple of these validations just to give you guys an idea. So the way this model works is once somebody does an override, they can actually go down to the bottom and change what they called phasing in this organization. So they can actually change the monthly values. So in this case, if I come over here and I see data in here, So the stuff that's on the right is what currently exists. So I'm going to pick one like this one. So I've got 78 in January and 77 in February. So some of the rules that we had for this was that they can change how many units are in each month, but they can't effectively change the total units in the year. So if I want to increase this by 20 and decrease this by 10, and then decrease another month by 10, but I put in 100, that's a net of negative 90. So if I try to save this, it's going to come back and tell me that there's an issue with this. And if I put my cursor over any one of these cells, it's going to tell the user what they did wrong. The cell has been modified. Adjustments must not have a full year impact. So currently the data has a negative change of 90, negative 90. So if I go back and fix this to negative 10 and I save this, it'll let me save this and it'll make those changes. The other validation on this form is that we don't want a user to be able to make a month a negative value. So in this month, we've got roughly 98. This month, we've got 70, roughly 77. So let's say I want to take, I don't know, 100 out of February and move it to January. Go back into that form. I hit back. Sorry about that. So in that row, if I say I want to add 100 here and subtract 100 from February, and I try to save that, it's going to stop them from saving, because if I take out 100 from February, it's going to give me a negative 33.022, and I can't have a negative value for the units in any month. Another example is force forms. So in Workforce, and this actually caused a problem for this organization, they can change their payroll type from hourly to basically salary. And then over here on the right, they have an effective hourly rate and then a salary rate, or a salary. So if I change this from hourly to a salaried value and I try to save this, it's not going to let me because I haven't entered an annual salary. So what happened with this client was they had a lot of people going in here and changing these preceded values from their HR system, and they didn't enter in the annual salary. So since they were a salaried employee and they had no annual salary, they got zero for their salary for that year. And they ended up being almost $500,000 short on their budget, and they didn't find this until it was too late. So, this is one of those situations where they had to put their tail between their legs and go back to the CFO and tell them that their budget was short. So if I put in an annual amount here and I take out the hourly rate and I save this, it'll let me save. Something that might be a little bit more relevant for a lot of you, especially if you don't have Workforce, is validating data in a form that's financially related. So in this case, we've got a couple different rules here. I've set this up so that no value can be more than 50% of So no value can be more than 50% of the data. The BDF can be no more than 50% of the NDF. So in this case, I've got 20 and I've got effectively 0 here. So that's more than 50% greater. So what it says is that it can't be more than 50% of NDF unless you have a comment and explain it. So if I go in here and I add a cell comment, and I post that and then close it, and now I try to save it, it's going to let me save that because I've added an explanation as to why I violated that rule. So, I mean, if you think about things like that, like I said, you have so much access to so many things in these forms that there's almost nothing you can't do with validation. You know, and I'll go through one more example here on the spend form. I'm sorry, on the new brand family form. I've got some rules set up in here that your gross product can't be more than, I believe it's 30%, and it can't be less than minus 20% or minus 10%. So if I put a negative 20% here and a gross profit of 50%, and I try to save that, it's going to come back and tell me that I violated a couple rules. So the first one, it has to be between negative 10 and 30%. That's negative 20. Same thing for this one. It's too high. So if I change this to 25% and this to 4%, and I save it, it'll let me save it. So again, these are, you know, somewhat basic validation rules, but I just wanted to give you guys an idea of how flexible and how robust your options are. I mean, literally, you can do anything that you want to do in these validation rules. So before I go on, I'll just make sure you guys don't have any questions. So if you want to throw up your hand, I can unmute you. All right, I'm probably going to butcher your name, but is it Ariel? Or...
Yes, exactly.
All right, go ahead.
So my question is, if you develop that kind of validations, do you have to develop them per form or, for example, per account, and you can reuse them on different forms?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's actually in the business rule itself that you create these rules. So if you've got 2 or more forms that are similar enough that have the same validations, you can share them. So if you've ever used scripts and rules in Calculation Manager where you're sharing, you know, scripts in a BSO calculation, and you, depending on how you do it, it's probably graphically, you drag the script over and drag it in the business rule. You have the exact same logic in the Groovy Calculations, and you can do the exact same thing. So it's not really, you don't define the logic on an account like in the dimension library or somewhere else. It's just like a BSO calculation in that regard. So you put that logic in a BSO, or I mean in a Groovy calculation, and then you can share that same logic with scripts and embed it in multiple business rules so that it can be used in multiple places. And that's kind of how I've set a lot of this up. I set a lot of variables up, and I get the point of view on every form. So there's a lot of generic logic that I'm going to use on every single form that I'm using Groovy on. So I've kind of embedded that into a script, and I put that script at the top of my business rule so that I can reuse that logic. And then again, if you change it, it's changed everywhere as well. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Anybody else have any? All right, so we've covered the majority My word. Maybe I should have updated this before the meeting. I was afraid if I did my update for Microsoft, it'd screw everything up, but. All right, so, we've talked about, some of this stuff with the ASO limitations that you have. You can basically completely bypass that because you can actually run calculations. You can do the same calculation logic that you can in any business or in any BSOS-based calculation, and you can do it in Groovy if you wanted to. I've done it with allocations. I've done it with FX rates. I've done it with generic business logic like, rate times volume. And I haven't run into any issues. And actually, it's been as quick, if not quicker, doing it in Groovy than it has been in Essbase. The other things, if you've ever done anything where you're trying to split strings in Essbase calculations or use like mid functions or concatenate, a member name with a, I don't know, with a UDA or something like that, those functions tend to be very slow. Those functions tend to be very slow in Essbase. So all of that stuff can be done in Groovy, and it can be done very, very quickly. So I have started actually doing a lot of comparison with comments and things like that inside of Groovy to execute calculations. So the last thing I wanted to mention is if anybody wants a more personalized demonstration or walkthrough on this, you can either stay on the line or you can send me an email at kgoodfriend@axalytics.com. We are going to be having a lot more of these webinars. We're going to try to do one, maybe even two a month on different topics. Some of them are going to be a little bit more technical focused. Some of them are going to be functional. And I'll make sure that the people that attended, I'll add to the distribution list so that you make sure that you're included on any future communications with that. So, and that's the conclusion of the webinar. We've got 8 minutes left that are scheduled, but I'd be more than happy to stay on the line and talk to anybody that wants to talk in any more detail about some of the possibilities or how hard this is to do. So again, if you want to raise your hand and I'll open you up or unmute you so we can have that discussion, I'd be more than happy to. Otherwise, thank you very much for attending and look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Hey guys, can you hear me? Hello?
Sorry about that, I was on mute. Go ahead, Raj.
A quick question. So, great presentation, by the way. Just a quick question on what I used to do. I used to write some, for example, intercompany eliminations, right, inside an Essbase. So I used to write them outside using the SQL and bring it into the Essbase. Do you think, or I might need to pay more attention to the Groovy, do you think those SQL codes can be converted into this Groovy? Is something that I should look into, or it's a different tool set?
I do think it could be. Nobody's actually asked me about eliminations with this, so I'm kind of thinking out loud. But are you doing eliminations based on, like, first common parent, or
Exactly.
how are you doing it?
So in HFM, we have that entity based, right? But
Mhm.
for my customers, we are doing in a different dimensions apart from the organization. For that, I wrote a SQL script which grabs the dimensions out of SBase cube and does this elimination logic, go find the least common parent and assign that with the reverse sign. So there was a logic behind it.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking with this Groovy, is it possible to convert those SQL queries or that logic directly inside these, inside this planning or SBase application?
I think it would be. So you can query metadata, and you can put that metadata in arrays, and then you could, compare those two arrays.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I haven't done it yet in Groovy, but uh, I'm sure it's possible. I'm just, again, thinking out loud. If you took the two members, the to and the from, and you said, give me all the ancestors,
Mm-hmm.
and then you traversed up until you found the first common one, you would have that common parent, and then you could execute the logic based on that.
Yep, exactly. So I'm just trying to see if it probably I'll definitely try it and I'll let you know. But I'm thinking out loud again. I'm gonna decrease the time spent extracting the dimensions and pushing the data into the SBase. So if I do with Groovy, I might able to remove that lag time.
Yeah,
Just to think out loud again.
yeah, and so from what I've done so far, I've actually had a lot of success with performance, um, on doing some of this more complex stuff in Groovy. So yeah, I definitely think you could do it. The one thing, so I will tell you that when I first started doing this, I don't have a Java background or a Groovy background. So when I first started doing this, I was looking at the API
Mhm.
in PBCS and looking at some of the examples that some of my coworkers had, and then trying to figure out and kind of back into how they did it. And there were so many things that I would ask them, hey, I don't see this in the PBCS documentation in the API. How did you know to put, a star.sbase name after this string to get an array of member names in the point of view?
Mhm.
They would say, well, that's Groovy. If you know Groovy, you know that exists.
Yeah.
So, the one struggle that I had when I was getting into this was there were so many things that I didn't know Groovy. So I didn't know to even, like, look to learn more about Groovy to know that those things were even possible. And I wouldn't say struggle, but I really limited what I was able to do in the first month or two. And then as I started getting more comfortable and I started asking questions to people, in the field that knew Groovy, and had them explain more about, the Groovy language and why certain things aren't documented in the PBCS API. I started realizing some of the breadth of what you could do was just way more than what I thought it was originally. So that's the only thing that I would probably recommend if you don't have, a Groovy background. The more you know about Groovy, the more you're going to be able to manipulate the API to give you what you want.
I agree. Yep. Thanks you.
You're welcome. So anybody else have a question? There's 5 or 10 that are still on the line. All right, guys. Well, thanks for attending.